pass it. Thank you.
Great, Raymond. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, this evening. The topic of today is in-home supportive services, otherwise known as IHSS. Next slide, Raymond. Okay, so before we begin, we just want to provide a disclaimer. The following presentation is meant for education only and doesn't constitute legal advice or legal counsel. Your situation may be unique and require careful attention. And also keep in mind that the information in these slides could become out of date as the laws and the local practices relating to these matters are constantly developing. So for example, let's say you refer to this the copy of this presentation 2 years from now, right? In 2024 or 2025, it could be possible that at that time, this information is out of date. And we just want you to keep that in mind. Next slide, sorry. The topics for today, we're going to discuss what is IHSS, who is eligible for IHSS, what kinds of services does IHSS provide, how does one apply for IHSS, and then we're going to cover the appeals, the basic appeals processes for IHSS. Next slide. So what is in-home supportive services, IHSS? So IHSS is a Medi-Cal program for people, including children with disabilities, to remain safely in their homes. And this is an alternative to out-of-home placement, such as living in a nursing home or an assisted living facility. IHSS provides basic services to individuals who can't safely perform the tasks themselves or need significant prompting. IHSS is also administered by each county under the discretion of the California Department of Social Services, or CDSS for short. Next slide. Who is eligible for IHSS? So any California resident is eligible for IHSS if they meet the following criteria, right? They have to be blind, disabled, including children with disabilities, or be 65 years of age or older. They must also be eligible for Medi-Cal or SSI, which is supplemental security income, or the state supplementary payment. And for Medi-Cal specifically, there has to be a Medi-Cal eligibility determination. And the process for verifying your Medi-Cal eligibility from the time you submit your completed application to when you actually receive the benefits identification card, right? The thing that demonstrates that you have Medi-Cal, it normally takes about a month to a month and a half. And that's the general process. So if you are not Medi-Cal eligible, or receive SSI and are looking to receive IHSS services, it's important to first get that Medi-Cal eligibility determination. Another thing, the individual has to be living in a home or apartment. And in the next slide, we'll discuss exactly what that means, but this doesn't include a hospital, a nursing home, assisted living, or a licensed care facility. And then, of course, the last requirement or requisite is that one can't live safely at home without assistance. And for that reason, they require IHSS. Next slide. Okay, so home. What is a home? And when you think of a home, you probably think like a single family residence, right? But it's more broad than that, right? A home under California law, under the Welfare and Institutions Code, a home is simply an abode of your own choosing. So some alternative living situations are allowed. Examples including you can live in an RV or a trailer, a homeless shelter, a hotel or a motel, or even emergency extraordinary circumstances will be considered. Let's say you are just temporarily in between homes, right? Because you were evicted and you're living for a substantial amount of time with family member, right? That would also qualify. So it's all depending on the circumstances, but a home is not literally a home, right? It can mean several things. And here we have a link to an all-county letter that gives a little bit more information about what a home constitutes. And it provides more information about what can be considered a home and what is not considered a home. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the kinds of services that IHSS pays for. And there's several. There's domestic services, related services, personal care services, accompaniment to medical appointments, paramedical services, time-limited services, and protective supervision. And we're going to cover most of these in more detail. And another thing, so it includes all those services. Next slide. Okay, domestic services. So these can be defined as general household chores, right? To maintain the cleanliness of a home or a space, wherever you happen to live. And this can include the following. We have a list here: sweeping, vacuuming, washing and waxing of floor surfaces, washing kitchen counters and sinks, cleaning the bathroom, storing food and supplies, taking out the garbage, dusting and picking up or cleaning an oven or a stove, cleaning and defrosting refrigerators, cleaning kitchen appliances such as the oven, stove, or microwave. And in some rare instances, right, bringing in fuel or heating for cooking purposes from a fuel bin in a backyard, for example. That's very rare, but it's one of the listed services. And then also changing bed linens. And something we do want to point out that these are just some of the ones that we've listed, but when there's a very specific service that's identified and documented by a county social worker as necessary for the person to remain safely in their home, then it may be obtained in terms of domestic services, right? An example being changing light bulbs or cleaning a wheelchair or changing and recharging wheelchair batteries. So it's all very fact specific, but as a general rule, this is the list that social workers rely on, but it's more extensive than that. Next slide. So related services. So related services are often grouped with domestic services, right? The services I just described, but it's important to note that these are separate and distinct services. And we're going to go into detail about what all of these constitute, right? So let's first talk about meal preparation or meal cleanup. So meal preparation can be defined as planning menus, preparing foods, cooking and serving meals. Meal cleanup, on the other hand, right, could be cleaning up the cooking area after you've cooked a meal, washing, drying, and putting away cookware, dishes, utensils, or even loading or unloading a dishwasher. So something to keep in mind that cleanup can constitute many different things, right? But what meal cleanup does not constitute, right? It doesn't include general cleaning of the refrigerator, stove, the oven, the countertop, and the sink. These services are actually considered domestic services, which we previously described. And the reason being is because they're not necessarily related to meal cleanup, right? Cleaning up after one's had a meal or after cooking a meal. The next one we have here is laundry. And this includes washing, drying, folding, and putting away clothes and household linens. Grocery shopping, which can include making a grocery list, traveling to and from the store, shopping, loading, unloading, and storing food that was purchased. And then we have other shopping and errands, the miscellaneous, right? And this could mean picking up prescriptions, buying clothes or toiletries, reading important documents such as medication instructions, food labels for people that may have allergies, reading utility bills, or even rental agreements, lease agreements. So those are considered other shopping or other errands. Next slide. Personal care services. Okay, so this is considered non-medical care. So this includes feeding, bathing, grooming, oral hygiene, bowel and bladder care, dressing. We're going to go into more detail. But let's start with feeding. So feeding means assisting someone with eating their meals, including cleaning their face and their hands before and after meals, and bathing, grooming, and oral hygiene. We're going to group them together here. So this is assisting a person with bathing or showering, shampooing, drying, and combing or brushing their hair. It can include shaving someone, applying lotion, powder, or deodorant, It could also include brushing someone's teeth, flossing their teeth, cleaning their dentures if they have dentures. And so, yeah, so this is under bathing, grooming, and oral hygiene. And then some of you who have IHSS and probably have noticed on their notice of action that sometimes they have listed routine bed bath as a service. And this is giving a person who is confined to a bed a routine sponge bath in bed. And that's what routine bed bath means. And also we have bowel and bladder care here, which is assisting a person with using the toilet, right? Including getting them on and off the toilet, using a bedpan, a urinal, emptying and cleaning ostomy bags, enemas, applying diapers or disposable undergarments, barrier pads on beds if someone wets the bed at night, wiping and cleaning a person after they have defecated, or even washing and drying the person's hands after they have defecated. Dressing is assisting a person to put on and take off their clothes as necessary throughout the day, morning, night. Transfer, this means helping someone get in and out of a bed or on and off seats. And this includes transfer from a bed to a chair, the couch, to a wheelchair, or a walker, another assistive device. And this usually occurs within the same room. And then oral hygiene, we previously mentioned. Ambulation is help with walking, getting in and out of cars. It could also mean helping the person in and out of the car when you're transporting them to medical appointments and or alternative resources, a daycare. For example, we have help with prostheses, which includes leg braces, visual hearing aids, artificial limbs, can include taking off or putting them on, or maintaining and cleaning this prosthetic devices. We have help with medications. And of course, this is different from what we previously mentioned, right? Help with reading medication instructions. This is reminding the person to take the medication, right? Prescribed medication or over-the-counter medications, and setting up medisets, which are those plastic medication organizers that a lot of people use. So those are the main, right, services. But there's some here that we didn't list, but I'll mention. One includes rubbing skin and repositioning, which is rubbing the skin to promote circulation and or to prevent skin breakdown. This is people that are often bedridden, right? Another service is menstrual care, right? Assistance with the external placement of menstrual products. That's also a service, another personal service. Next slide. Okay. Time-limited services, meaning that they are not continuously provided throughout the year, right? Sometimes when you get a notice of action, it tells you these are the services that you're going to be getting from now on until there's a change. Time-limited services are services that are given for a very specific amount of time, not to last longer than 3 months in most cases, right? The first one we have here is heavy cleaning. And this is a thorough cleaning of a home, right? To remove hazardous debris or dirt. And this is authorized one time only and only under certain circumstances or conditions. And some examples of when heavy cleaning will be authorized, right? When you're first being granted IHSS, when you stop receiving IHSS or are ineligible for a year, and then start receiving IHSS again, meaning you're applying as if you were applying from the beginning. So you would be entitled to this. When you're living in conditions that result in a threat to your safety or the safety of people living in the home, or even where a person is at risk of eviction for failure to prepare a home for fumigation, or some of you may or may not know, right, that a reason for eviction could be if somebody has pests in the home and have not adequately addressed pests in the home. So for that reason, some people will get an eviction notice. But in this instance, right, if you're receiving IHSS, you can ask for heavy cleaning services so someone can help you thoroughly clean the home to get rid of pests if there are any. The next one we have here is removing yard hazards or yard hazard abatement. And this considers weeds or high grass or shoveling ice or snow. So for weeds or high grass, right, this is light work in the yard to remove high grass or weeds and trash when these things pose a fire hazard. They're only authorized one time. And then for shoveling ice or snow, for people who live in an area where it snows, this is a removal of ice, snow, or other hazardous substances from entrances or essential walkways when these materials make access to the home hazardous or make it very difficult. Teaching and demonstration. This is rarely provided, but it's something that one can receive. Someone is entitled to if they request it. Teaching and demonstrating those services provided by IHSS providers so that the recipient can perform services which are currently performed by IHSS providers by himself or herself. And certain limitations apply to this. That's saying, right, so an IHSS service is teaching and demonstrating a person, and this, let's say a person who's disabled, right? Teaching them how to do a service so that they don't have to rely on the provider, right, to do the services for them. So it can include housework, meal preparation, meal cleanup, laundry, bathing, feeding, dressing, even yard work for adults in this case. So you can teach a person, an IHSS recipient, these skills or these services, and the provider will be given a certain amount of hours to teach these individuals. But most people don't get more than 3 months, right? That's the maximum in this case. So you'd get a certain amount of hours every month until you teach the skill, which is saying, right, this is rarely done because in most cases, a provider will just do the service indefinitely. Next slide. Okay. So now we're gonna talk about protective supervision. So protective supervision is a service within IHSS that allows a person to be supervised and protected from injury, hazards, or harm, essentially 24 hours a day, 24/7, right? Due to dangers that are created by a person's behaviors. So here we have a list of when protective supervision would be warranted, right? When one can, these certain factors have to be met in order for one to likely qualify for protective supervision. So one, the person needs to have a mental impairment or a mental illness. The person has to be non-self-directing due to the mental impairment or the disability. And what does this mean, right? What is non-self-directing? And this is an inability to appreciate the dangers or risks that are caused by one's behaviors, which in turn are caused or emanating from a disability, right? A mental impairment or disability. And that person does not have any awareness of those dangers, right? That can result from their behaviors. And this is evaluated by three things, right? Three concepts: memory, orientation, and judgment. So, right, what one can have, so they rank it in there's 3 rankings that they give for memory, orientation, and judgment: 1, 2, and 5. 1 being that there's no, it's not severe, there's no impairment, right? And then 5 being there is a very strong, very substantial deficit in that area. So memory, right? Memory is being able to recall learned behaviors, right? And information from a distant past or a recent past. Memory, pretty self-explanatory. Orientation is an awareness of time, place, self, and other people in one's environment. And judgment is one's ability to make decisions, right? As to not put oneself in danger, which goes to, does this person appreciate the risk they're putting themselves in based on, with their behaviors? So that's what they use to determine if someone's non-self-directing. 3, the person requires 24-hour supervision, right, to safeguard against self-injury, hazard, or accident. This is not literally 24/7 supervision, right? This just means that the person needs constant supervision. So it's acceptable, right, to leave a child who's non-self-directing for 5 minutes in a room by themselves, right? But any more than that, they would pose a danger to themselves based on their behaviors. And then the last thing we want to mention here is that for children or people that are under the age of 18 years old, the minor must also need more supervision than a child of the same age without a mental impairment or disability, right? So, and this is what they call a neurotypical child, right? Meaning a child of the same age without a mental impairment or disability. And a question to consider for this is, does it take you more time or intensity to care for your child, right, in comparison to a child of the same age without a mental disability? And you should consider the nature, the frequency, and the duration of the interventions, right? How often do you have to intervene? How long? So, next slide. So here we have examples of behaviors, right, that may require or may need protective supervision, right? Wandering from home and getting lost, eating non-food items, wandering into the street without checking for cars, attempting tasks beyond one's physical or mental capability and not understanding the risk of injury, right? Trying to move furniture or heavy objects, which a person cannot, right, but they still attempt, climbing onto high countertops or high furniture, and then jumping off, right, with no appreciation that they can get hurt. They can break a leg, a bone, right? Turning on the stove and forgetting to turn it off, biting oneself or scratching oneself, or if someone has a lack of stranger danger awareness, right? They're very comfortable with strangers. And then here we have a link to the SOC 821, which is a form that's filled out by a medical professional, right, who will evaluate, right? They will give their assessment as to why they believe a person needs protective supervision. Okay, so when is protective supervision not available? So it's not available for friendly visiting or social activities. What does this mean? So friendly visiting and social activities don't meet the criteria of protective supervision because they don't involve monitoring and supervising a person's health and safety, right? These are things that provide social support and companionship to a person, but they don't involve direct assistance with activities of daily living. And for that reason, they don't qualify for protective supervision. Another situation, right, that does not qualify for protective supervision is when the need is caused by a medical condition and the form of supervision required is medical. And an example of this, let's say a person has diabetes and needs supervision, right, in case they become hypoglycemic, right? They may need insulin. That is not a service that would be provided under protective supervision. It may be a paramedical, right, service. In most cases it is, and Nadia will talk about that in a later slide, but that wouldn't qualify for protective supervision. Something else that doesn't qualify is anticipation of a medical emergency. So let's say somebody has congestive heart failure, right? And they want protective supervision because there's always an anticipation of a heart attack. But it's not predictable, right? So this particular situation would not qualify for protective supervision. It also can't be used to prevent or control antisocial or aggressive behavior, such as getting into fights or destroying property. For example, if a person has a history of aggressive behavior, right, and they need help to manage that behavior, but they don't need constant supervision, then protective supervision in most cases will not be provided. The person may require other things like, for example, behavioral therapy or counseling, but not necessarily constant supervision. And for that reason, this would not qualify for protective supervision. And also, protective supervision can be used to guard against deliberate or self-destructive behavior or self-injurious behaviors, such as when someone knowingly intends to, or knowingly commits harm against themselves, right? Like we mentioned, scratching oneself, biting oneself. And the reason why this would not be something that would be covered under protective supervision is because in that particular case, there are situations where that person would not always require constant supervision to prevent harm, right? Individuals may be able to manage the self-injurious behaviors through therapy or medication. And because of that, they wouldn't need constant supervision. Ultimately, though, the person's specific situation and their needs are evaluated by a medical professional through that form that we just shared, the SOC 821. And the doctor would, for example, if there is self-injurious behaviors that are constant and they're due to a person's mental disability, then it's possible that that would qualify for protective supervision. And that said, it's important to consider the specific situation for the person that's asking for protective supervision. If it's truly needed, it will be provided. And here we have a link to the MPP, which is a manual of policies and procedures. It's essentially the law that guides several government agencies in the county, right, as to how they should evaluate things like IHSS. Okay, we can go to the, oh, I think this is I think we can stop here.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, to take questions, we can stop
right now. Awesome. Great. Thank you. So we are going to first talk about paramedical services. And paramedical services are a different kind of category of services available under the IHSS program. So paramedical services are prescribed by a doctor for a person's health and require some training and judgment to perform. So necessary paramedical services are really those ordered by a licensed healthcare professional who is lawfully authorized to do so, which persons could provide for themselves, but for their functional limitations. So there is a very helpful DRC publication on that link that covers paramedical services, and we'll get into it more on the next slide. Great. So this is an IHS service, and it is provided when the following is demonstrated. The person cannot perform the service at all, and that activity is necessary to maintain the person's health. So when we think about paramedical services, we think of it in terms of their own health, a medical necessity, rather than something that's personal or domestic or for protective supervision. This is for their own health. And the service requires training and judgment to perform. So this really can't just be anyone being the provider for paramedical services. They have to have some kind of training. And it is possible to get training specifically to be the provider for paramedical services, and that can include puncturing skin or inserting a medical device into a body orifice. So paramedical services will not be provided unless they are ordered by a licensed healthcare professional using the SOC 321 form, which I will explain in a bit. So paramedical services must be provided at the licensed healthcare professional's direction. And the licensed healthcare professional must determine the time needed to perform the service. So paramedical services have to be very, very specific. And licensed healthcare professionals include doctors and other professionals whose license permits them to order the paramedical service, such as a registered nurse, physical therapists, or occupational therapists. So in order to receive paramedical services, a recipient must give informed consent. And consent means you must give permission to receive paramedical services ordered by the professional. And the IHSS recipient also has the right to choose who the licensed healthcare professional is to complete the paramedical order. So some examples of a paramedical service would include administering medicines or giving injections. So Daniel spoke about the non-medical help with medications, and that would be, reminding someone to take medication, organizing medicine, or cutting their pills in half. That would be non-medical help. But an example of a paramedical service would be putting medication directly in someone's mouth or crushing the medication and placing it in the food. So other examples include range of motion exercises, pressure sore or wound care, catheter insertion, catheter changes, emptying the urinary drainage bag, assisting with emptying bladder, tube feeding, trach care, and suctioning. There's more. These are just a few examples. It's not exhaustive. But the important form to fill out for paramedical services is the SOC 321 form. And this is the request for order and consent for paramedical services. It's a pretty simple form. It's just 2 pages and you can find it online through that link. You basically fill in your medical provider's name and information. So it can be addressed to the medical provider who will then fill out the information. And it will include answering questions such as to whether the patient has a medical condition that results in a need for IHSS paramedical services and listing the condition. And it also requires the doctor to list the paramedical services need that are to be provided by IHSS. So remember when we talked about how specific paramedical services have to be, that's where it comes into play in this form. So when the doctor lists the paramedical service, the doctor should name the type of service. So for example, administering medication, the time required to perform the service each time performed. So the frequency, the number of times and time period. So we'll say 7 times a week for 5 minutes each time in the morning, and how long the service should be provided. And so the doctor should then sign the certification, and the patient should sign that the patient has given informed consent. And so the completed form must be received by the county before your provider can be paid to provide these services. And you need to make arrangements for your new provider to be trained by your doctor on how to provide any paramedical services you need and the risks involved. And of course, if you are not sure about how the services should be done, so for example, with a catheter insertion, you should ask your doctor about this. And importantly, with paramedical services, you and your provider should discuss what to do if there is an emergency while your provider is performing paramedical services, because that can happen. And it's really, really important that your provider not perform any paramedical service for you until they have received the proper training by a licensed healthcare professional. So even if you know what to do and you tell them, it's, the best advice is always to have them be trained or given that advice by your healthcare professional, because they will be able to tell them what to do in an emergency if something happens to you in that extent. So that is paramedical services. We are next going to talk about children's eligibility. Thank you. So IHSS takes into account the needs a disabled child may have that exceed those of a child without disabilities. So Daniel kind of discussed this. We're not really comparing one child with a disability to another child with a disability. We are comparing a child with a disability to a neurotypical child. What would that child, an 8-year-old without a disability do in this situation? So an eligible child with a disability can receive the following services: personal care services, related services, paramedical services if prescribed by a doctor, protective supervision, and assistance with travel to approved places. And I kind of briefly spoke about this in response to a question, but domestic services are generally not provided to minors, so those who are under the age of 18. And I will get into that more in a couple slides down, but basically there is a presumption that those who are minors typically don't do a lot of the domestic work in the house. So there shouldn't be some kind of IHSS service for those, because someone who is neurotypical wouldn't be doing those services anyway, a minor. So how are hours calculated? Next slide, great. So IHSS establishes maximum monthly hours depending on whether you are considered severely impaired SI or non-severely impaired NSI. And according to IHSS regulations, whether you are NSI or SI is determined by adding the hours in the following categories: meal prep, meal cleanup, respiration assistance, bowel, bladder care, feeding, routine bed bath, dressing, menstrual care, ambulation, transferring, bathing, oral hygiene, grooming, rubbing skins, repositioning, helping with prosthesis, and paramedical services. And so you're considered to be severely impaired, SI, if you receive 20 hours or more in the above categories each week, and you are considered to be non-severely impaired if you receive 19 or less hours in the categories that were just described. So there are 4 programs under IHSS, and if we can open that link there, where it's the Disability Rights California pub, if that is possible, I just kind of want to show a chart there. Great, thank you. And if we can just scroll down a little bit to that chart. Great, perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. I feel like it's always helpful to give a visual because this can be kind of confusing. So there are 4 programs under IHSS to determine the hours and to determine like which program you belong to. So the first program is the Personal Care Services Program, PCSP. And to be eligible for the Personal Care Services Program, you must be receiving full scope Medi-Cal, and your IHSS provider cannot be your spouse or parent. So you must have full scope Medi-Cal, and the IHSS provider cannot be a spouse or parent. So this is like when you can hire someone. So whether you are non-severely impaired or severely impaired, the maximum you can get is 283 hours monthly. So the next program we have is the IHSS Plus option, IPO. And to be eligible for IPO, you do not qualify for the Personal Care Services Program because either your IHSS provider is your spouse or parent. You receive advanced pay, and advanced pay is basically an option for IHSS recipients to receive an advanced payment for their monthly services to pay their providers directly. Or you receive a restaurant meal allowance. And a restaurant meal allowance is given to IHSS recipients who have adequate cooking facilities at home, but their disabilities prevent them from using the facilities. And with IHSS Plus option IPO, if you are non-severely impaired, the maximum hours you can receive per month is 195 hours. And if you're severely impaired, the maximum hours you can receive is 283 hours per month. And the third program is the Community First Choice option, CFCO. And to be eligible for CFCO, you must be eligible for full scope, federal financial participation, Medi-Cal, and meet a nursing facility level of care. And so whether you are non-severely impaired or severely impaired, the maximum is 283 hours per month, but only 195 hours per month can be for protective supervision. And it is suggested that if you are on IPO, which was the program we just spoke about, the IHSS Plus option, but can also be on CFCO, the Community First Choice option. It's sometimes advised to switch to CFCO because CFCO allows for a greater maximum of hours, and you may benefit from the spousal rules in that. And then the final program that not many people are eligible for, and I'll explain why in a second, is the IHSS residual. And to be eligible for IHSS residual, you do not receive full scope Medi-Cal or do not receive full scope Medi-Cal with federal financial participation. So generally IHSSR is for lawful permanent residents. So it's generally for people who are not citizens, but are here, are LPRs, lawful permanent residents. And so only 1.4% of individuals receiving IHSS services are under this program. And if you are non-severely impaired, it would be 195 hours per month. And if you are severely impaired, it would be 283 hours per month. So those are the 4 programs. I know I just spoke a lot, but the link is provided for the PowerPoint. We can go back to the PowerPoint, and this publication really delves into these details more. I'll just wait to get back to the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you so much, Raymond. Great. Okay. So let's now talk about proration. So when IHSS services can be met in common among anyone in the house, the hourly need for that service should be prorated. So for example, if multiple people benefit from the provision of a related or domestic service, then the time it takes to prepare that service is divided equally among everyone who benefits, including non-IHSS recipients in the household. Because, typically when you make dinner, you're not, for a family and you have 3 kids and 1 kid has IHSS hours, you're not just going to make one separate dinner for that kid and then make, a dinner for the other 2 kids or the rest of the family, of course, if they have dietary restrictions. But so let's just talk about an example. So if it takes a parent 100 minutes to do weekly laundry for all 5 members of the family, and that includes the parent and the 1 single IHSS beneficiary, then the amount of time allotted to the IHSS beneficiary is 20 minutes. So it's a family of 5, and there's 1 member that has an IHSS benefit. So you're going to do 100 minutes divided by the 5 members of the family, and it would be 20 minutes. So it'd be 20 minutes for the laundry. And so the services that are heavily prorated are domestic services and heavy cleaning, and related service. And generally, if a service is not provided to more than 1 person at a time, it should not be prorated. So we're now going to talk about alternative resources. So alternative resources are IHSS-like services you receive through other programs, such as an adult daycare program or school. So after determining the amount of alternative resources you receive, the social worker will deduct this time from your total assessed need. So adult or child daycare centers, community resource centers, senior centers, and respite centers are usually the main alternative resources. It's not limited to those, but if identified, these service hours would be reduced from IHSS hours. So that can be a little confusing. Let's go over a quick example. So let's say you live in a household with your IHSS provider, and the provider cleans up after breakfast and dinner for both of you. You then go to an adult daycare center where you receive assistance cleaning up after your lunch. In the meal cleanup category, there would be a column labeled services you refused or you get from others. There, the county social worker would first add up the total amount of time spent cleaning up after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then the social county worker would make an adjustment or proration because the cleanup services your providers provide benefits both you and the provider. So this means the social worker assigns your prorated time to you in the column amount of service you need. Then the county social worker would indicate the cleanup assistance you receive from the alternative resource, such as an adult daycare program. And that would be, the information would be listed in the services you refused or you get from others column. So that's kind of how alternative resources work. If you or your child or someone a client attends adult daycare program, a child daycare program, a community resource center, a senior center, respite center, some kind of program like that, that's generally where alternative resources would come in. So let's go over tools. I know this is a lot, so I really appreciate everyone just staying with us here. So the first one we have, that link there, that is a notice sent out to all counties. It is an all county letter. And it's regarding the IHSS assessment process. It clarifies the California Department of Social Services expectations of the county social worker's role and responsibilities in assessing and authorizing IHSS program services. So in your own time, if you do want to learn more about it, you can click on that link. So we're going to go over now functional index rankings, and this is kind of related to the hourly task guidelines. So if we can go to the next slide. Great. So this is a chart, and it's going to make a little bit more sense when I explain it. So with the functional index rankings, there are generally 6 rankings from 1 to 6. And 1 means you are fully independent. You are able to perform the function without human assistance. Rank 2 means you are able to perform a function, but you need verbal assistance, such as reminding, guiding, or encouragement. Rank 3 means you can perform the function with some human assistance, which can include, but it's not limited to, direct physical assistance from a provider. Rank 4 means you can perform a function with only substantial human assistance. And rank 5 means you cannot perform the function with or without human assistance. And rank 6 means there is an extraordinary need requiring full human assistance. So from rank 1 to rank 6, rank 1, you are fully independent. You can do it on your own. Rank 6, there is an extraordinary need that requires full human assistance. And specifically for minor children, this is what the chart is. All minors should be assessed a functional rank of 1, fully independent, unless an extraordinary need is documented. And again, the rationale for that is, a lot of the things like laundry, meal prep, ambulation, a lot of those things, if you look at the ages, they're not going to be doing housework at age 4 or 5, or laundry. So they would be considered fully independent because the IHSS service would not be covered, if that makes sense. And so we do have hourly task guidelines, and the hourly task guidelines advise the county IHSS social workers to determine the functioning using those rankings and then give hours based on the ranking. So when we speak about, number 1, how do you determine that this child or the person is fully independent and doesn't need any help? So that's the responsibility of the IHSS social worker. And so the IHSS social worker must determine how much help you need to do each task. So they use those hourly task guidelines. So they begin by ranking your functioning in, domestic services, housework, laundry, shopping and errands, meal prep, all the things that we spoke about. And so a rank of 1 would mean you're independent once they, go through each and every single category, and to see whether you can complete the task with or without help. And so once they determine that, the next step is to use those hourly task guidelines to determine how much time can be authorized for each task. And exceptions to the hourly task guidelines are only allowed when necessary to enable a recipient to remain safely in their home. And exceptions only apply to time, whether it's 5 minutes or an hour. They don't allow the addition of any tasks not already identified under the service. So if you just want extra dusting, they're not going to allow it because that's in the addition of a task. But if you want to alter the time and that's necessary to enable the recipient to remain safely in their home, from 5 minutes to 15 minutes, that is more likely, you're more likely to get an exception for that. So, you can just take a look at this chart. It is from the California Department of Social Services. I think it's still up to date, but this is just a good idea to see in regards to minor children. And yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the application process and then the appeals process, and then we will take questions. So how do you apply for IHSS? So you will contact your local IHSS County Welfare Office and apply. And that link there lists the county IHSS program websites for each county. And the application itself is called SOC 295. It's about 8 pages. You basically fill in your information, personal, whether you're a veteran, SSI information, if applicable, past IHSS information, household info, all that kind of stuff. And you basically fill in your information and authorize release of your healthcare information to a licensed healthcare professional, as we previously discussed. The second part would then be completed by your healthcare professional, which is essentially a brief questionnaire on whether you qualify for IHSS. So they would answer questions. It's a questionnaire, and they would answer questions such as, is the individual unable to independently perform one or more activities of daily living? And the healthcare certification form that they would fill out is called the SOC 873. And the SOC 874 is provided with the SOC 873 and will provide the due date, which is usually 45 days from the day the county social worker requests it. And you may be able to ask for an extension if you are having issues obtaining the signed SOC 873. And if you are planning to apply for IHSS, make sure that you try to make an in-person appointment with the doctor to complete a form. And this also applies if you are applying for protective supervision. You can bring it in that SOC 821 form, which was spoken about in, I think, on slide 14. So we will go to the next slide. And this is very important, the self-assessment and the social worker home assessment. So a county social worker will interview you at your home to determine your eligibility and need for IHSS. So this will be, based on your ability to safely perform certain tasks for yourself. The social worker will assess the types of services you need and the number of hours the county will authorize for each of these services. So really the purpose of the home visit is to find out what you can and cannot do for yourself, what services you need, and the time your provider needs to perform those services. So your job here, whether it's for yourself or for your child, is to help the county IHSS worker understand all your care and special care needs and what they mean in terms of time. So it's really important here to be honest and open. Don't minimize, the disability problems and care needs, because if you do, you may not end up getting the hours you need. So I'm not saying, exaggerate it, but just be very honest and frank. So even though you may feel embarrassed, explain things fully so the county worker fully understands your situation. So before the county worker arrives, have the IHSS worksheet in part 2, which was on the previous slide, ready with the hours you think you need. So the county will authorize only what you really need and will not allow extra time for comfort services. And when I mean by comfort services, I mean, as I mentioned in the previous slide, extra dusting to make things look nice for guests. So be prepared to explain your worksheet hours, make a list so you will not forget anything, what tasks you need or what your provider does, how you determined the time each takes. So, especially it's especially important if there are differences between what the county authorized before and what you believe you need now. So write all those things down, be thorough. You should speak about why the state hourly task guidelines are not appropriate for your own care needs or may not apply to your situation. If there are special factors to be considered, everyone's situation is quite unique. Speak to them, and also make a note of the time that the person comes to the home and when they leave. Take notes of the questions they ask, the responses, the conversation. This is really important because if you don't get the hours you need, it can be just quite burdensome and annoying to have to go through the appeals process and try to fight for more hours. So we are next. Yeah, so there's the 873 form that I already discussed. It's similar to the healthcare certification form, and there's a guide there, and that helps you prepare for that initial intake assessment that you would need to get those hours. So next we're going to talk about the appeals. So to ask for an appeal, you must complete the following within 60 days. The notice of action are for 90 days. That's for something different that I will get to. But in regards to an appeal, you must complete the SOC 856 form to appeal within 60 days of the day the county tells you that you are not eligible to be an IHSS provider. So that's for the provider, not for the hours. So that's 60 days. And once an appeal is received by the Department of Social Services, a finding regarding the support or denial of an appeal will be completed within 180 days. So what I'm talking about is if you are applying to be an IHSS provider and you want to appeal, that is 60 days. And so now with regards to the notice of action. So your IHSS social worker must send you an IHSS notice of action each time a decision is made related to your eligibility for IHSS. So for example, once your IHSS application has been processed, your county social worker will send you an NOA. If your hours are increased or decreased or your services are terminated, you will receive an NOA. And if there are changes made, you will get an NOA. So if you have applied for, have received, or are currently receiving benefits or services from an assistance program and you receive an NOA, and you receive an NOA from a county or a letter from, Covered California, for example, denying or reducing your benefits, or you returned in an application and the county did not act on it, you can ask for a state hearing. And so if you are requesting a fair hearing because you feel you were not awarded enough hours of service, you should file your request within 90 days of the effective date listed on your notice of action. So that'll be 90 days if you feel you were not awarded enough hours. And if your appeal is based on a reduction of those IHSS hours or a loss of benefits, you should request a hearing before the NOA's effective date, and you should request aid paid pending. Aid paid pending will allow you to continue receiving services while the case is being reviewed. And if you do not get an IHSS NOA, or your NOA takes effect in less than 10 days from the time you get it, you should ask for a hearing and aid paid pending your hearing right away. Generally, IHSS is required to send your NOA 10 days before at least 10 days before the change in your services is supposed to happen, because that is meant to give you time to ask for a hearing before the change is supposed to happen, so that your benefits can continue at the same level. And if the county does not give you that advance notice of the change in your IHSS benefits, the county must reinstate your IHSS benefits retroactively. And even if you lose your appeal, you will not have to pay for any services you received while your case is being decided. And honestly, your case, it can take several months to be decided. So it's good to request aid paid pending and to still have those services in the interim. And generally, the first page of your NOA will tell you when the NOA will take effect. And if you want information about your hearing, or how to get information for your hearing, say you end up going to hearing, gather information about how the county IHSS worker determined the hours you authorized, make an appointment to go into your IHSS office to review that case file, ask your social worker for a copy of the latest needs assessment forms. And those forms will include notes about why hours were or were not given. You can also ask for a copy of the most recent SOC 293 forms, because those forms include information on the functional ranking about what you can and cannot do. If you are challenging a reduction, ask for copies of both your new and old county assessment forms and your new and old SOC 293 forms. So you just want to gather a bunch of information. If IHSS reduced your hours, ask your worker for copies of the regulations listed on your reduction notice, just to be prepared for that hearing if it does come to that. And yeah, that's it for appeals. We can go to the next slide. Great. So these are just some resources. The first one is the Disability Rights California publication on IHSS. It is a holy grail for a lot of us. It's really informative. It's really helpful. We highly suggest you click on that. You'll also be receiving this PowerPoint, but if you just kind of want like a one-stop shop on IHSS, that's a really helpful link. Of course, we have our intake line. You can click on that second link, or it's provided in the chat if you have a particular matter that you would like to discuss further. And then the third link is the California Department of Social Services website, where it has the all county letters, all the policies and procedures on IHSS regulations. And then the fourth one is also the Department of Social Services website that has more resources and guides on IHSS. And yeah, that is about it. So if you guys have any questions, I did see some hands. Daniel and I are more than happy to take some